So I'm going to stay here in the comfy chair, partly because it's here, partly because sometimes when you need to talk about something that's a little bit uncomfortable, you maybe want to do it from a place that you feel comfortable. That being said, I'm going to sit right on the edge of the chair so that I'm a little bit uncomfortable. But I need to talk about something this morning that I'm a little bit uncomfortable talking about because it's something I've not talked about before, and I want to, I just want to share some ideas about it. I don't think, I'm not satisfied with the conclusion that I've come to. It's not really I'll just talk. So, it occurred to me this week that, looking at the lectionary, there were lots of choices this week. The gospel reading this week is the story of Jesus feeding the multitude, and I've always had lots to say about that. Lots. You can read my blog even this week, it's about it. But I've always had lots to say, and I've talked about it before several times. And I looked at the passage from Hebrew Scripture for today, and I realized I had not ever talked about it before. And I realized why I had not talked about it before, because I'm not comfortable talking about it. Because there's something in it that's a little bit uncomfortable, I think, for me. I have a question about it that I've always been kind of afraid to ask about it. It's a story of Jacob, and this is a part of Jacob's. Bearing in mind, I'm not really happy with Jacob anyway, right? He's not one of my favorite characters in the Bible. It just seems like his life is continually blessed despite what is happening in it that he's responsible for. But that's not the thing. That's not the thing. So what's happening in the story at this point is that Jacob has spent 14 years, give or take, with his cousin Laban, and he's gotten married a couple of times, a bunch of children. He's had a piece of his life. And he is on his way back to his parents and his brother Esau, who he deceived. And he's worried, too, about how Esau is going to receive him, because, of course, Esau will want revenge. He left in the first place because he thought Esau was going to kill him. Who knows where Esau's at now? So he's on his way back with his families, on his way back, and he gets to the river, and he decides, I'm not really sure what's going to happen. I'll send Esau some cool stuff and see if that makes him any happier. Maybe he'll forgive me because I gave him stuff. You know, the typical thing that Jacob does. And I will split my family into two groups and send them to different places. And that way, if Esau decides to take revenge, at least part of my family will get away. And so here he is, he's done that, and here he is at the river. It's night, and he's by himself. And he meets a figure in the darkness. And he struggles with this figure. He wrestles, fights, struggles, whatever language you want to use. He struggles with this figure until dawn. And dawn comes, it doesn't look like either of them is going to win, and so the other figure injures Jacob so that they can end the battle. But of course, Jacob still doesn't want to give up, and he's not going to give up until the figure blesses him. The figure does, and then is gone. And Jacob realizes who the figure was. He realizes it is God. And the thing about that is, we have different ways of understanding all of that stuff. Sometimes we see it as metaphorically, Jacob is struggling with his own demons, right? In fact, there was some thought at one point that the figure was in fact a demon. It wasn't an angel or God, it was in fact a demon, and that's why the figure appears at night and has to be gone by dawn, which is interesting thinking, but frankly, if it is a demon, it's probably a vampire then, right? Because it's got to be. I think that's a little imaginary, but okay, that's one thought. Another thought is that It's an angel. And again, that's great. Except then why does Jacob think it's God? And is it because Jacob knows it is? Or is it Jacob's own arrogance? There's lots of questions around that. But somehow, having wrestled with this figure all night and demanded a blessing of it, and not only being blessed, but being blessed with a new name, which means contends with God, not only that, he realizes that he has been fighting with God. And of course, God has to leave before the morning. This is another thought about this story. God has to leave before the morning because in the light of day, Jacob would see God's face, and no human survives seeing God's face in person. Isn't it funny how all of the language that we use to describe that story references God as if they're a person? I'll come back to that in a second. None of that is disturbing to me. Sorry, this is a really comfortable seat, and I'll start to nod off. None of that is disturbing to me. The part of that's just this story that's disturbing to me is around one particular thing which I have always hesitated to mention or even asked about for a number of reasons. Because it's a thing that, well, I even mentioned it to Laurie the other day, and her response was kind of, I don't see it that way. I've looked it up several times. I've tried to find somebody else who might have wondered the same thing, and nothing. Can't find anything. And the thing about that is that, okay, so it could be an original thought, although it's 2021, I'm not sure that's possible. But it could also be that it's a question that's been asked, and nobody wants to hear it again. Or it's just a question that we don't really want to talk about because it's discomforting. I think it's the third one, but I think it's discomforting in a good way. My issue is this, I'll tell you. My issue with the story is this. God cheats. If the figure is indeed God, God cheats. Now, you instantly might be uncomfortable hearing me say that and thinking, how dare you? But in fact, I would ask you to think about that for a second and just think, is that uncomfortable because I just suggested that God cheats? Or is it uncomfortable because I just suggested how this wrestling, struggling was ended, and it was not ended necessarily in a good way? The thing is, let me describe the situation to you in different terms. There are two combatants engaged in a wrestling match. They appear to be equal. The match goes on and on and on. They appear to be equal until one of the combatants intentionally injures the other. Even then, the other combatant doesn't give in. But the point of doing that was to end the battle, to end the fight. Doesn't that sound like one of the combatants cheated? Doesn't that sound like... Okay, so I know we've all seen... This is going to be one of those moments where Robin references some movies that nobody's ever seen. But in Karate Kid, the original one, the good one, there's a tournament at the end. And Daniel, who's the hero, is fighting all of the guys who are very definitely not the heroes. But there's a tournament, and the head of the master of the other dojo instructs one of his combatants to sweep the leg, to intentionally injure Daniel so he can't continue into the finals. And the guy, knowing he'll be disqualified for it, does it anyway. The point was to intentionally injure him, to eliminate him from the finals. If you haven't seen the movie, you should watch the movie, because it's a great movie. And I'm not going to tell you it ends. You can guess. But the point is he intentionally tried to injure him. Is it kind of like that? Or is it maybe a little bit more like another obscure movie reference? but it's Star Trek this time. Captain Kirk is famously the only cadet in Starfleet ever to have beaten a test called the Kobayashi Maru. It's a test that's designed for you to fail. You can't win. It's a no-win scenario. That's the point of the test, is that people who are training to be leaders, captains, like Kirk, have to face the no-win scenario and ultimately death, right? It's part of their training, because at some point they may well have to face that. And so that's what the test is all about. And Kirk is the only one who manages to defeat the test. He wins. In, I think it was Wrath of Khan, one of the movies, a young officer asks him how he managed to do that. How did he beat the no-win scenario? And his answer is, he reprogrammed the simulator in order that he could rescue people from the ship, the Kobayashi Maru. Another one of the characters goes, "You cheated." And he says, in fact, no, he didn't cheat. He changed the conditions of the test, and in fact got a commendation from Starfleet for original thinking. Did he? He changed the conditions of the test. Did he cheat? Or did he have a really creative idea of how to solve the no-win scenario? Which is it? Well, who knows, really? It depends on our perspective, doesn't it? The fact is that in the story, injuring Jacob's hip doesn't in fact end the battle. Jacob perseveres and still will not let go. But it's the moment that moves things forward. A night of struggle, a traumatic moment, and that moves things forward. We have experiences in our lives that are like that, where we are struggling with something. We may even be struggling with God, and there is a moment that moves things forward. And it may be a good thing, it may not be a good thing, it may be a traumatic moment. It may be a moment of success, which in its own way is a traumatic moment. It's a dynamic moment that moves things forward. The other thing that's really interesting to me about the story is that figure really a figure? Is it a person that Jacob is struggling with? Or is Jacob indeed struggling with himself? Is Jacob, in fact, struggling with the image of God that is in him? Having spent this lifetime of both cheating people and manipulating people, and trying to get his own way, living his way, and having already been blessed by God once, is this the moment at which Jacob realizes the presence of God in himself and struggles to understand that and come to terms with that? See, there's this, this is one of the things about only hearing little vignettes of a bigger story. We just heard this little piece because perhaps we want to make a particular point about struggling with God. But the fact is, how Esau got here is important. On his way, running away, how Jacob got here is important, because the first time he encounters God, he's running away from Esau. And this time that he encounters God, he's running back to Esau. Or reluctantly going, let's say. He's traveling again. And he's going back. And he anticipates that Esau is going to want revenge. At the very least, he'll want to punish Jacob. He'll be angry. And as the story progresses, past the dawn that ends this battle, Jacob comes to Esau. And Esau doesn't want revenge. Esau forgives him. And Jacob says something like, I expected to see the face of anger and hatred and revenge, and instead I see the face of God. He's just had this experience where he believes he has struggled with God and survived. And the very next person he encounters, he sees the image of God. See, I think Jacob has been struggling with the image of God in him and trying to figure out, in that struggle, trying to figure out how to live into that image of God, how to be able to see it in others. Maybe that moment of trauma wasn't so much cheating as simply a means of moving forward, finding a way to go forward. Because sometimes we move forward from struggle, away from struggle, sometimes into another struggle, but we move away from it. Sometimes we are pushed from it. Sometimes we are able to move ourselves away from it. Something happens that moves us. This has always been my wonder about this story. Is it in fact the blessing and the dawn that moves Jacob forward? Or is it that moment at which the fight is essentially ended, and yet he still won't give up? He still wants to go forward. And what he goes forward to is suddenly realizing and seeing the image of God. Not just in the struggle he's just experienced, but in his brother who forgives, who has compassion. And maybe that's a connection too to the gospel story today, the story of Jesus feeding the multitude. It doesn't matter whether you think, and I know I've talked about this before, but it doesn't matter whether you think it's a miracle of Jesus displaying his divine power, or whether you think it's a miracle of Jesus inspiring people to share. That is a miracle. Imagine how miraculous that would be today if we looked at all of the people around the world who are hungry, the people in our own community who are hungry, and we found a way to share with them so that everyone was fed. We'd call it a miracle. It's a miracle. The point is not whether it's the divine power of God or inspiration to share. The point is what inspired that miracle in the first place. Jesus just had a traumatic experience. He just heard that John, the person whose job it was to tell people that he was coming, John, who announced the arrival of the Messiah, the prophet that said, "Here's Jesus," has been killed by Herod. He's also Jesus' cousin, by the way. And Jesus just wants to get away from everybody, and he tries to, but the crowd follows him. And he has compassion on them. That's how Matthew describes it. Jesus tries to get away in a boat. He goes somewhere. He gets out of the boat, and there's a crowd there waiting for him. And instead of getting back on the boat and going somewhere else, he has compassion. I think that's a key element of the story of Jacob, too. Finding compassion. And finding that that's the face of God. I wish we could see the face of God more today. Because we live in a world that desperately needs compassion. We are struggling hard. And we need to see compassion. When this whole pandemic thing started, we saw it a lot. We heard stories about frontline workers and essential workers. We suddenly realized that people, what we thought of as an essential worker, included lots of people we had not thought of before, sadly. But now suddenly we were. We were realizing how important people, not just doctors and nurses, but the people who clean the hospitals were, how important people who stock grocery shelves were, how important truck drivers were, how important all of the people are. We found ourselves suddenly wanting to get to know our next door neighbor that we didn't know very well because, well, we couldn't go anywhere, and we wanted to make sure they were okay. Or that elderly person who lives down the street. We just want to make sure they're okay. We saw that all over the place in the way teachers took on the responsibility of helping their students who could no longer come to the school. We saw compassion all over the place. And now that we're moving away a little bit more, we're freer to do some more things. We're kind of hearing it a little bit less. Maybe we're just not telling the stories. Maybe they're there, but then we should be telling the stories. The point is, we need compassion in our struggle. We need the moments that move us forward and to realize that's what's happening. And we need to find compassion in doing it. We need to find blessing, because that blessing is being able to see the face of God in ourselves and in all of those around us. Amen.